Good evening. Thanks everybody for turning out. On the eve of midterms, no less. It's quite a turnout this evening, given where we are in the calendar. Please join us here in Piper, November 12th, 6:30 p.m. for Christophe Giraud from the ETH Zurich. And the 18th of November, the following week, Zanetta Hong and myself in conversation in Stubbins at 12:30 on her work as Kiley Fellow. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2014-15 Olmsted Lecture and to introduce tonight's Olmsted speaker. As you know, we host the Olmsted Lecture once a year. Nominally, it's a talk about ideas in landscape architecture, and this evening is a particular treat for me personally because we get to hear about the idea of landscape architecture. It's a pleasure to welcome Joseph Disponzio. Joseph has training both in landscape architecture and in history. He's a noted historian and has taught in a range of institutions, including our very own Graduate School of Design, as well as at Columbia University. He has practiced in a variety of roles, and most notably for our purposes this evening, a part of why I'm interested to have him here is I think it's true that he has done the most consequential work in the English language on the origin and etymology of the professional identity of the landscape architect. It's a particular treat given that the two previous invitations that he accepted were interrupted first by an act of God and then by an act of man, I believe. So the third time is the charm. Joseph Disponzio.
Thank you, Charles, and I applaud your courage for this third invitation. Also because he has some idea of what I'm going to say. So let me just get a glass of water and so I don't have to interrupt myself again. Okay. So most of what I'm going to do is I'll be reading, and this is a very text-based lecture. So please, you're not supposed to make an apology before you start a lecture ever, but accept the apology. Yes, exactly. Yeah. As a landscape architect of some 30 years standing and a historian of the profession, it is an honor to deliver the Frederick Law Olmsted Lecture here at Harvard, where, as many of you know, the first academic program in landscape architecture began in 1900, the profession itself having been named, or at least formed, 100 years before that. My remarks tonight will focus on the events leading to the establishment of the profession and to ground it, as it were, in a body of theory and practice out of which landscape architecture matured into the complex, dynamic, and vital profession it is today. I am driven by the belief that in knowing the history which gave life and form to landscape architecture, we discover what we have always had but which has eluded recognition. And in the process, we develop an understanding of who we are and from whence we have come. With such an understanding, we are not necessarily better practitioners, but at least we are armed with the potential to be so. I believe that the knowledge of the history of landscape architecture enriches its professional practice. My claim is easy enough. Through the course of the 18th century, the human modeling of the land evolved from garden making into a new, distinct enterprise, which today we call landscape architecture. The individual who practiced within this enterprise, the landscape architect, was named at the beginning of the 19th century. How this happened will be the focus of my talk. It is in three parts. First, a brief prologue. Second, an intellectual background to the events, which spurred the change. And third, a look at the individual who named the practitioner of the profession, that is Jean-Marie Morel. What I say tonight should not be taken as a slight by any means to the honoree of these lectures, that is Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted is the father of landscape architecture, but Jean-Marie Morel is his distant, unknown French uncle. The garden as a locus and as an idea is as old as history itself. The concept of landscape is a relatively recent cultural invention. Between the 17th and the 18th centuries, the formal representation of the garden was replaced by a new conceptual framework, as suggested in these two images. Given the requisite talent, the designer of Stourhead potentially had the ability to design Vaux, but the designer of Vaux, the supremely capable André Le Nôtre could never have designed a Stourhead, nor for that matter any English-like garden. Le Nôtre's inability to design a Stourhead has little to do with this formal difference. Rather, and more fundamentally, it has to do with the ontological questions raised by their difference. If we accept that gardens are representations of how we organize space, and that organization says something about how we conceive and experience space, and consequently, how we see ourselves in the world, then Le Nôtre's inability to design a Stourhead is understandable, indeed given. The world of the mid-18th century was not part of his experience, neither culturally, scientifically, technically, or metaphysically. He simply did not have it in his consciousness to conceive of such a landscape. The 100 or so years that separate Vaux and Stourhead are only a brief chronology, considering that the design of Vaux participates in a tradition of gardening dating to a deeper past. That is to say, for millennia, garden design was conceived on orthogonal space, Vaux being perhaps one of the most exquisite exemplars of that tradition. Stourhead's break with that tradition represents much more than a formal change. To appreciate what is at stake here, we need to recognize that the design of the orthogonal in space was not a neutral act of putting forms on the ground. It had a much greater significance, which Pythagoras had uncovered. As he had done for sound, Pythagoras discovered a numerical relationship of the visual field by demonstrating that the symmetry of space, whereby a fourfold displacement around the perpendicular brings one back to the same orientation. From this observation, he deduced his famous theorem, turning a particular fact into a universal truth. It is not just the world of experience that was built on this orthogonal relationship, but the constructed world as well. Vitruvius venerated the right angle and its geometric counterpart, the square and rectangular forms, etc. It is from him that builders henceforth assumed the tradition. The square became the paradigmatic symbol for Eden, and hence the form of the medieval cloister. It was a form supremely suited for its purpose, a perfect vehicle for its manifold symbolic content. In the constructed world, designed by T-square meant nothing less than participating in the reality of the universe. There is no history of gardens without the orthogonal, as this grossly schematized diagram suggests. The change of form of the garden from medieval times to the 18th century demonstrates the persistence of the orthogonal. The disposition remains throughout the Renaissance and the Baroque, although disposed differently in space, endlessly reticulated and preoccupied with symmetries and axes, until it is superseded in the 18th century by the picturesque or English garden. Whether or not designers of the Renaissance and the Baroque were conscious of the considerable symbolic heritage, which, as Terry Comito has noted, may have become, quote, adulterated to a mere nostalgia or a bureaucratized, rigid allegory, unquote, they nonetheless worked in a continuing tradition. After eons of designing gardens with a stubbornly fixed set of formal devices, each with its own abstracted meaning, predicated on perpendiculars and regular geometries, all is changed in the 18th century. Millennia-old traditions of garden making eclipsed without the slightest bit of protest or regret. The abandonment of the rule of decussation in the garden and its consequent change configuration are not isolated events. They could not have occurred were it not for the profound transformations in intellectual history that took place beginning with the scientific revolution and culminating in the Age of Enlightenment. Virtually every aspect of the human condition and human understanding of world and self came under reevaluation, including religion, philosophy, science, technology, aesthetics, literature, the arts, not to mention politics, social and cultural institutions, economics, and society as a whole. The fallout of all of this turmoil was the secularization of experience and a concomitant new relationship among God, nature, and man. For most of history, God, nature, and man were mutually bound together. Any change in one had to be measured against a change in the other. Under assault during the Age of Enlightenment, the Gordian knot that held these three together became unraveled. Nature, which was the metaphysical linchpin of the relationship, acquired its own autonomy and thus became worthy of study in its own right. With the changing nature of nature, a new way of envisioning the world developed. Eden as a model worked well for the mutually dependent God, nature, man triad, but when the relationship changed, the wall fell, and so to speak, and not only were Adam and Eve banished, from the garden, but so was the orthogonal. With its configuration changed, its meaning was undermined, its demise a foregone conclusion. A new space, as it were, was created, spurred by the reconceptualization of the natural world, and with its consequent new way of modeling land. Given its independent status, nature became a singular focus. It lay at the heart of the new investigatory spirit of the age, which is the essential hallmark of the Enlightenment. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, one of the spokesmen of the age, wrote in 1759, quote, "A very remarkable change in our ideas is taking place, a change whose rapidity seems to promise an even greater transformation to come," unquote. Diderot put it more dramatically, "A new order of things was born." This new order was given voice in one of the great intellectual enterprises of the age, Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, whose first volume appeared in 1751. The dozens of entries devoted to natural and physical sciences are solidly grounded in Lockean empiricism and the presuppositions of Newtonian science, stressing that the observation of nature will reveal the universal laws of the material world. Earlier in the century, the Abbé Noël Antoine Pluche did much to increase the awareness of the natural world with the publication of his multi-volume The Spectacle of Nature between 1732 and 1750. Pluche, though not a scientist, was an effective writer and skilled assimilator of natural history, making it accessible to a general audience. The authoritative source for the study of natural history of the age, however, was Georges-Louis Leclerc, Count Buffon. His 44-volume Histoire naturelle was the only publishing venture of the 18th century to rival the Encyclopédie in importance and size. It was a phenomenal success, receiving 10 editions of the entire work in the 18th century alone, translated into English, German, Dutch, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin. It is noteworthy that Buffon and Pluche were among the most popular books of the 18th century, surpassing Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse or the Encyclopédie in popularity. The natural sciences were not the only realm of knowledge undergoing fundamental reevaluations. Empiricism infiltrated philosophy and changed the course of metaphysics and aesthetics forever, the greatest casualty being Cartesian rationalism yielding to sentiment and sensation. Through a tangled confluence of philosophical and aesthetic theories linking and drawing from John Locke to the Abbé Condillac, from Roger de Peel and the Abbé Dubois to Edmund Burke, by mid-18th century, Cartesian rationalism was effectively replaced. The publication of John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding was the most significant work in empirical philosophy of the era. Its influence was enormous. The enlarged fourth edition, published in 1700, was translated into French by 1714. The foundation of Locke's philosophy is that all mental activity, whether the accumulation of knowledge or the production of feeling, is dependent on the sensory stimuli of the external world. Locke's magisterial work successfully challenged the rationalist innate-based philosophy of Descartes. The Abbé Condillac, who's the closest Locke had to a disciple in France, refined the Englishman's philosophy and presented perhaps the most cogent treatise on the nature of the senses. He argued, following upon Locke, that human reason and emotions result from external stimuli. Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful was an exploration of the senses and how they are produced, affected, and controlled. The work released beauty from the hegemony of classical proportions, thus providing a new theoretical approach to aesthetics, and not unimportantly, gardening. Burke's philosophy further privileged emotion over reason, something Roger de Peel had voiced in his prescient Cours de Peinture of 1708. While much of Enlightenment history has focused on the philosophical battle between Cartesian rationalism and Newtonian empiricism, as significant a battle was being waged between the followers of a mechanical understanding of nature and the proponents of the life sciences. Diderot, whose thoughts on the interpretation of nature correctly recognized that a decisive turning point in the sciences was at hand, was the foremost philosophe to lead the debate. His metaphysics were grounded in Buffon's science. For Buffon, nature was a vital force, une puissance vive, that embraces and animates everything, a creative energy of perpetual change that comes from within, not some static mechanical force measurable from without. His work in the natural sciences revealed a complex world in continual transformation, a world understood as a system of organic interaction and mutability of natural phenomena. In directing his efforts to the newly emerging life and earth sciences, Buffon's achievement was nothing less than to outline their structure independent of the authority of mathematics, a mathematics that could not meet the descriptive requirements of natural history. Implicated in these brief remarks is the utter importance given to the transformation of the meaning and understanding of nature through the course of the 18th century. The Encyclopédie entry on the subject ran for an unprecedented 14 columns over 7 pages. It is no exaggeration to state that nature was the datum of all philosophical inquiry. In bracketing the transformation of the idea of nature, Kant noted that at the beginning of the century there was Naturbeschreibung, the mere description of nature, whilst at its end we had Naturgeschichte, the history of nature. While with its newly acquired autonomy, nature began to be investigated in its own right, thus paving the way for the rise of scientific disciplines such as biology, chemistry, and geology. It cannot be a coincidence, then, that the development of a new gardening tradition coincided with the new spirit of inquiry into nature, abetted by sensationist metaphysics and the new organic outlook on the natural world. Gardening, as a product of culture and composed of nature, could not escape fundamental shifts in the intellectual environment that nurtures and sustains it. The Enlightenment legacy of changes in aesthetics, metaphysics, and especially in the idea of nature, and the understanding of the natural world, almost by default, ensure that the art of gardening would be dramatically altered. And indeed it was. Beginning in the first third of the 18th century, a new natural landscape topology emerged, and a few decades later, its theory was formulated. During the 1770s, an unprecedented number of books on the new genre were published. I believe these books constitute the theoretical foundations of an entirely new landscape design tradition, which today we call landscape architecture. Thomas Whately's Observations on Modern Gardening of 1770 was the first book that can be considered a theoretical work on the new conception of landscape. It was so popular that it received a second edition within the same year. The French and German translations followed in 1771, the year of its third edition. The first French treatise on the subject was Claude-Henri Vatelet's Essay on Gardens, appearing in 1774, followed by Antoine Nicolas Duchesne's On the Formation of Gardens of 1775, with the second edition in 79. Jean-Marie Morel's treatise on the theory of gardens came in 1776 and was quickly followed by René de Girardin's On the Composition of Landscapes. To these can be added Louis Carolgis de Carmontel's The Jardin de Monceau of 1779, Le Rouge's folios on fashionable Anglo-Chinois gardens from 1776 to 88, the German Hirschfeld's 5-volume Theory of Garden Art, 1779 to 78, William Chambers's dissertation on Oriental gardening, and hundreds of didactic poems, essays, and the like, all on the new design tradition. The publication of these texts in French, English, and German, all within 10 years or so, is suggestive of a decisive turning point in landscape history, so much so that the garden is eclipsed by landscape and gardening by a new entity, as yet unnamed. While they are all tethered to some previous garden heritage, there is no mistaking the new, original, and wholly self-contained quality of the works. They incorporate to varying degrees the changes in aesthetics, philosophy, and the natural sciences of the age. They contain no plants lists for the most part. They are devoid of plans and technical information. Instead, there are no discussions of proportional systems, geometrical relationships, sequencing of spaces, symmetry, and any of the previous methods and techniques of designing gardens. Devoid of plans and views, they are, as Whately wrote, quote, illustrated by descriptions, in a direct appeal to the imagination. In their most secular act, they look beyond the traditional garden wall and take in a view rich in pleasure, utility, industry, and ruin. The new garden theory immediately found resonance in related fields and was quickly recognized for its innovation. In particular, the stress on natural history was given implicit recognition. Whately's Observations received a lengthy 2-issue review in the Abbé Rosier's Observations on sur la physique, the most prestigious scientific periodical of its day. Whately's book, groundbreaking as it is, was not as rigorously scientific as Morel's theory, one reviewer of which proclaimed that until then there had been the art of gardening, now there was its science. The common thread in these works is the rejection of anything resembling André Le Nôtre's style in favor of a more natural manner of modeling land. On a metaphysical level, although few claimed it as such, they were operating in the realm of empirical sensationist philosophy, creating gardens that move the soul through the manipulation of natural features such as earth, rock, water, and vegetation. To varying degrees, all authors accepted that artifice should be subordinate to nature in the creation of gardens, but they did not necessarily agree on what the new landscape should look like. The rejection of Le Nôtre's style posed a technical problem. As noted, garden design up to the 18th century was predicated on the select arrangements of regular geometries arranged around the orthogonal, drawn on flat surfaces in accordance with the rules of proportion, perspective, and taste. Translating these designs into the field posed no problem as long as the ground was itself flat, be it a horizontal or inclined plane. However, once the topography was made to respect or emulate a natural condition, garden designers faced a serious challenge. Axes, perpendiculars, and regular shapes were ill-suited to the dictates of the new style. Architecture theory, such as found in Jacques-François Blondel's numerous works, was confounded by the requirements of the new garden. Faced with the rapid transformation of garden design, the architect could not bend theory to practice, thus resulting in his replacement. The vacuum created by the removal of the architect from the garden was filled by an entirely new professional entity, soon to be identified. But if not the architect, then who? In England, the term landscape gardener stuck, but in France, things were different. All agreed that they were not architects, for they were not doing architecture, but there was no consensus on the new term. Girardin used artist, while Duchesne favored formateur. Morel was most emphatic that jardinier, or gardener, was not the correct term, but offered no alternative. In a clear indication of his preoccupation with naming the new design professional, he revisited the subject in his second edition of his book in 1802, not only lamenting that there was still no proper term for the person who designs in the new genre, but neither was there a name for the enterprise they were practicing. A few years later, however, he came upon, created, in 1804, he came upon architecte paysagiste, landscape architect, for the professional designation, a title which by the mid-19th century had gained wide currency, both in France and in the United States, I should add. Accordingly, a brief look at Morel is in order. Morel is best characterized as the capability brown of France, as his gardening style most resembles the English master. Like Brown, he had a successful career, but unlike Brown, who left no body of writing, Morel left a seminal work, The Theory of Gardens, upon which his reputation stands. The book is deeply indebted to a close read and understanding of the events in intellectual history which were occurring in real time. That is to say, his life, education, and career closely parallel Enlightenment events. By crafting a theory that incorporated the changes in intellectual history, especially the understanding of nature, his book was crucial to the reconceptualization of conceiving and designing landscapes. By dint of his 50-year career, he played a prominent role in the development, codification, and maturation of a newly developing approach to modeling land, which in concept, style, and means of construction was a radical departure from former practice. Beginning in 1754, Morel apprenticed as an ingénieur géographe, or geographical engineer, in his native city of Lyon, before entering the École des Ponts et Chaussées in Paris, where he studied between 1758 and 1760. At the same time, he also studied with Jacques-François Blondel, France's most important teacher and theorist of architecture. His educational training his education and training account, no doubt, for the rigor of his garden design. In an era when engineering was still a practice of manipulating the constituent parts of landscape, earth, wood, water, and rock, it can be claimed that everything technical one needed to know to practice landscape architecture is subsumed in the title of ingénieur géographe. That is, the education of the geographical engineer in the 18th century was a field field-based apprenticeship, emphasizing practice over theory, instruction centered on identifying, interpreting, recording the components of landscape in situ. This included natural landforms, hydrologic features, including lakes, streams, springs, groundwater tables, vegetative covers such as forests, meadows, fields, knowledge of the individual species of trees and plants, as well as knowledge of the cultural landscape, including productive forests, cultivated fields, arable lands, et cetera, and of course the constructed and inhabited landscape of cities, towns, and villages. In brief, one of the first requirements of the ingénieur géographe was to learn how to read a landscape. The second was the ability to analyze and synthesize it in its disparate elements into a coherent whole, and the skill to draw it. The process of map creation takes in the landscape tree by tree, rock by rock, spot elevation by spot elevation. When all the survey points are connected, the composite picture is not a unitary composition, but a diverse field of fragments whose logic is revealed by the natural processes that determine them. Landscapes reveal themselves not as something derived from an abstract aesthetic regulated by divine proportions, as can be claimed for architectural space, but as its antithesis, something seemingly chaotic yet naturally ordered. Beneath the infinite topographic variety of landscapes lay the internal mechanisms that create them. In learning how to read and survey and represent or map a landscape from its constituent parts, Morel developed an understanding of how landscapes were formed, composed, and structured, all of which was determined by natural law. Thus, Morel's training led directly to an appreciation of the natural processes of landscape formation, as much as the forces that altered them. He developed a critical understanding of the nature of landscape and the attendant sense of landscape process, which, when coupled with the aesthetic imperatives of design, would inform his landscape theory and practice. His education at the École put his field experience into proper form, allowing for the application of the techniques, practices, and methods used in recording and evaluating landscapes to the art of designing them. Morel deftly insinuates scientific knowledge and the understanding of the natural world into his landscape theory. One only need compare his treatment of landforms with that of his closest rival, Thomas Whately. The Englishman's book, Good as It Is, and Morel recognized it as such, tells us that landform is either concave, convex, or flat, purely descriptive terms taken from painting theory. Morel's chapter on landform recognizes the water cycle and its perpetual rhythm of evapotranspiration. Rain, the liquid state of the cycle, is short of catastrophic events, the primary natural agent in modeling land. Morel's natural science lessons is taken from Buffon's essay on the history of the earth, published in the first volume of the Histoire naturelle. Continuing his discussion of water's role in shaping landscapes, Morel acquaints the readers, or his readers, with the principles of river hydrodynamics and river valley geomorphology. Rivers are born in mountains and grow in size as they leave the region of their birth. Their meanders depend on the size and volume of the river's flow and on the substrate of the riverbed. Their speed is inversely proportional to the valley width, which increases in the downhill direction. He even cites the recent geologic finding that mountain valleys zig and zag in equal or corresponding measure in the horizontal plane. This supposed law was first recognized by the geographer Louis Bourget in the first third of the 18th century and was picked up by Buffon, who called it the key to the theory of the earth. Morel lifted this observation from Buffon without attribution. Morel also discusses islands, a subject not touched by any other writer. He admits two types of islands for gardens, a lake island and a river island, each with a different shape resulting from the conditions that formed it. An island in a lake is born of a depression being flooded and takes on the configuration of the topography. However, an island in the river is determined by the hydrodynamics of moving water, resulting in its unique lozenge shape. No other garden text of the 18th century included such a discussion. Morel devotes some 150 pages out of 400 to descriptions of natural history process. None of his contemporaries even come close to the subject matter, let alone the extensive coverage he gives to it. Page out of sequence. The connection between natural character of land and internal mechanisms which create it soon were made explicit. For example, in Wilhelm Gottlieb Becker's The Plauische Grund bei Dresden, includes a separate essay on the stratigraphy and bedrock geology by Andreas Tauber with these hand-tinted plates. In this otherwise voyage pittoresque, a genre book with a focus on landscape description, the inclusion of these plates is very suggestive of the very close relationship between landscape character and underlying geology. Shortly into the 19th century, the American natural historian Benjamin Silliman wrote, quote, "I have several times had occasion to remark that the picturesque features of a country depend very much on its geography," unquote. Morel's inclusion of scientific principles and observations of nature provides specific evidence of his sources, but does not, on its own, instance a broader theoretical framework grounded in the epistemology of the era. More telling is his calling landscape a great machine, or his invocation of the Newtonian mantra, action and reaction. Such terminology is redolent of the mechanistic vocabulary of Lumière. As much as Newtonian empiricism informed his work, it is from Buffon that he has derived the notion of an organically driven, naturally organized universe. It is Buffon who puts into scientific perspective the understanding of the natural landscape that Morel had experienced firsthand as an ingénieur géographe. The visible chaos of the natural world is only apparent, not real. It may look chaotic, but is internally structured. The natural world is the result of the processes whose underlying principles conform to natural law. Morel's theory recognizes that the interrelationship of natural forms was central to viewing the world as a dynamic environment of dependent systems. Landscapes were products of that system of dependencies, the understanding of whose internal laws must replace the normative characteristics of picturesque aesthetics as the object of landscape design. Utilizing the new methodological order that distinguishes 18th century thought, Morel identified the formative constituents of landscape and maintained that an understanding of the dynamics of the natural world must guide, if not dictate, landscape design. 2 centuries before it would become fashionable, Morel had adumbrated a method of designing with nature. I have attempted tonight to show with these remarks that the development of a new means of modeling the land constituted a reevaluation of not only how we design it, but how we conceive it. This could not have happened without the fundamental changes in the understanding of the natural world that occurred during the course of the Enlightenment. The material expression of this new understanding was given a new design typology, an attendant new theory was written, and in time, new techniques of design and construction were perfected. By the early 19th century, the individual who practiced in the new idiom had acquired a name. Morel was both witness to and participant in these transformational events. The late Stephen Jay Gould wrote that, quote, "We must not equate the fading of a name with the extinction of a person's influence," unquote. Morel's name may be unknown, but I wager there is not a landscape architect in this room tonight for whom his theory does not strike a resonant chord. Ecology entered the landscape architectural discourse in the 20th century. It gained authority with Ian McHarg, and with the notable inclusion of other elements in the design equation, such as cultural, social, economic, and political factors, it has gone through multiple variations on a theme. The idea of designing with nature in a social and cultural context is central to our practice and is subject to multiple characterizations. Process-driven design is a theme that is topical these days, and it might be a one-phrase summary of the work of Hargraves Associates or James Corner's field operations, among others. Landscape urbanism, a topic of prime interest to the GSD, is process and systems driven writ large. The recent issue of Harvard Design Magazine on the landscape core is replete with projects that engage natural process. Alison Hirsch's introduction to the collected essays of Jim Corner writes of landscape as, quote, "the medium that is dynamic and ever-changing," unquote. Corner himself writes in one of his essays, the unassailable argument, or he notes the unassailable argument that the specificity of sites lie at the very core of any significant works of landscape architecture, unquote. When we recognize that the genus of the place is the result of underlying natural conditions, then Corner's remarks recall the geologic cross-sections of Andreas Tauber and the works of Benjamin Silliman, both of which resurface, as it were, in recent essays by James Hutton and Anita Beresbetia, published in the Harvard Design Magazine just mentioned. Hutton looks beneath the surface of Central Park to focus on the underlying bedrock as a determining factor in the park's design, while Beresbetia studies how Charles Eliot used geology and physical geography as a framework for the design of the Metropolitan Park System of Boston. The same Charles Eliot was the impetus for the establishment of the landscape architecture program at Harvard in 1900. It was housed in the Lawrence Science School, and its dean was America's foremost and preeminent geologist, Nathan Southgate Shaler. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. taught drawing, history, and the principles of landscape design, but the program of study was heavily weighted in the applied sciences and engineering, including meteorology, drainage, road design, advanced mathematics, botany, horticulture, plant identification. Shaler himself taught the 4 required courses in geology and geography, which were intended to, quote, give a useful practical understanding of the geological structure to open the way to a better comprehension of landscape forms and a more intelligent sympathy in dealing with them. It is a curriculum that would have pleased Morel. Through 2 centuries of practice and 1 of instruction, landscape architecture has been subject to multiple episodes of internal questioning of its professional identity, disputes over practice, hand-wringing over nomenclature, misconceptions of what it is, its vague public perception, and a litany of other self-evaluations. But constant throughout, and implicated in the pairing of 2 commonplace words, is how we mediate the zone between art and nature, house and horizon. This is not only a central question of landscape architecture, it is a fundamental activity of human existence. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you take some questions?
Absolutely, sure.
And would you be comfortable managing them from here?
Oh, yeah, sure.
More comfortable. So
Yeah.
maybe we have some questions.
Questions?
Right here. Thanks, Joseph. That was great. I noted the first, or in all of the treatises that you showed, the word paysage appeared only in one.
One. Mm-hmm.
And could you say something about how that word comes out and why was it used so? I mean, what was the context for the use of the word, and why is it so infrequently used?
Yeah. Let's see if I can. We'll go back to
It was the
Jardin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, paysage in the, there it is. So, did you all get the question? So, paysage in the 18th century was landscape, and it was not in most of the treatises, as Anita mentions, it's only in Jardin's treatise that he uses the word. Why? It's not in the others, don't know. They were almost interchangeable because garden, it has to be understood, was not at all confined to a small, area. We're talking about hundreds of acres was a garden. So garden implied a paysage. I mean, that's probably the nearest I can get to, because all of these, like Morel's theory of gardens, or any of the other books that mention garden in the title, they're referring to landscapes, not to a small cultivated piece of ground.
I'd like to thank you also, Joe, for this refreshing talk. Could you say something about the catalog of the works, the garden works themselves of Morel, and their condition today? What we know about their conservation?
Yeah, let me get, okay. This is the Chateau of Arcelot, and it's the best preserved of Morel's gardens. He designed about 58 gardens. I've pretty much located every single one. The overwhelming majority of them no longer exist. Maybe a tree is there. The 5 that still exist are in private hands, and Arcelot is the best. He worked at those placeholders that I was showing you. Was Hermenonville, the slide with the lake and this island in the distance with poplar trees. That's, of course, where Rousseau was buried, and that was the home of Girardin. And Morel worked with Girardin. They had a falling out, and Girardin, I think they should both take credit for the landscape. But the interesting thing about Morel, and more to the point about it, because it's hard to, here I've just spent an hour or so talking about this theory. Does that relate to what he designed? Unfortunately, we probably don't have, scientists will say, well, we don't have a statistical sampling, strong enough statistical sampling. My observations visiting the sites is that they're all different. Some are very hilly, some are very mountainous. His watercourses are always, and where it makes a lot of sense, are in depressions. He doesn't try to move water where water doesn't want to go. He works with the natural topography. He often, there's a slight curve from the house to, because you can see we're not on axis with the garden facade of the chateau. He always has a slight bend left or right, and that invariably works with the landscape feature, generally a hill. So he's sort of skirting around the hill. So he's very conscious of working with, to the extent that I've been able to analyze these. More telling, and I deliberately didn't want to bring plans because it's a text-based talk, but his chateau of Houdicourt, it's in Normandy, very flat site, and basically if the garden is like a piece of paper, and the chateau is right over here, all of the property is here. And in design, if your building is here, or your property is here, how do you, according to the techniques of the day, using space, draw the individual out to the space over here? Axes are fabulous for drawing you into space. You just walk along the axis. What Morel did was, from the chateau that's here, he builds this huge lawn, and with trees populated, but he puts a cedar of Lebanon tree, an extremely dramatic tree. It's right over here, then one over here, and one over here. Those three trees effectively draw you into the landscape. You're drawn from house to the first tree. You see that tree, you look to your left, there's another tree. You walk that way. You look to your left, there's another one there. It's a brilliant way of drawing you into the landscape, because that is, once you get rid of orthogonals and axes, how do you sequence the space? And that took a while before the designers figured it out. I always say that, the first so-called first English garden, Kent's Chiswick, it's been elevated to the status of an English garden, but the site is completely flat. Any topography there is fill. So he's still working in a flat terrain, but because they simply did not know how to work on an irregular topography without leveling it. Question here? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Me? Yeah. Okay. I have two short questions. One that actually relates to what you were just saying, the practice of Morel. I'm curious to know, or whether you found out, how he actually went about his practice. So was he on the field, on the site? Was he laying out the pathways as he was walking through, as some designers did in the, at least in the late 18th century? So that's one of the things that I'm curious about. And the other thing, I was wondering whether you were able to find any clues as to how he reacted directly to the other treatises that came before. So how André Mollet, for example, some of the treatises that you showed us that talk, or Design d'Argenville, is there any reception or any reaction in his writings to those gardens, or not at all? Does he just ignore them entirely and just sets out on his...
I'll answer the second question first. His reception of previous texts. He doesn't address any of d'Argenville or Mollet or the 17th century texts at all, because the Lenotre style is completely just, it's not so much condemned, but rejected. Although Lenotre himself and specific purposes of of his style are accepted in urban instances, for example. However, in the second edition of his theory, he adds a very large preface, and in it he reviews all of the Whately, Vatelet, Girardin, all the poems. It's a wonderful. He loves Whately. Vatelet, he says, wonderfully poetic, but the man wasn't up to the task. It's a brilliant critique of the books that had gone before him. As to his practice, he died in 1810. His dates are 78 to 1810. He worked continuously. Prior to the revolution, he had a patron, the Prince de Conti, a very important prince of the blood. So he more or less didn't have to work. He didn't have to look for clients, although he did have other nobility and other people working before the revolution. After the revolution, he's imprisoned, he's almost killed, but he survives, and his career is jump-started by none other than Josephine. He's summoned to Malmaison, and through the circle of Josephine and Napoleon, he ends up working for all the bankers, the financial bankers of the Napoleonic Wars, and the rising bourgeois class. As to how he always went on site, in the Chateau of Arcelor, that contains an absolutely brilliant archive, you have these wonderful plans of very Le Nôtre-style, symmetric-style gardens, on which somebody, and I hope it's Morel's hand, has started just drawing, where things were. At the time, in his book, he doesn't really like plans. He says, the client doesn't understand them. And his contemporary, Thomas Blakey, who was also an admirer of Morel, Blakey was an Englishman, and Blakey specifically in his diaries say that, well, you design these things on the ground. You go out there with a rake or something. Morel made plans, but he also was on the site all the time. And the little secondary information I have about, or people who knew him, would comment on him, said he was apparently very critical. Fontaine at La Malmaison said when, he writes in his diaries, when Morel came, like he was brought, he said, he found everything we had done was horrible. Nothing was acceptable to his taste. Very cantankerous man, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for a great talk. My apologies if I speak from a position of complete ignorance, because I'm not a landscape architect. But I was curious because your discourse was it was totally about form and topography, and I'm wondering why there wasn't any reference to content. I guess I'm familiar with the kind of content to iconography. I'm familiar with the kind of the discourse about the paradise. Paradise was Claustri, the symbol representation of the rivers of paradise, Villa Lante, Villa d'Este, through to these kind of rather strange things like the Bomazzo and the Hypnotomachia Polyphily, right the way through to Stow and Stow Ahead. I think Kenneth Woodbridge wrote a book about Stow Ahead, trying to interpret in terms of Virgil's Aeneid, through to Alexander Pope and the kind of the way in which you could see the gardens as some kind of allegory of some deeper meaning. Yeah. Is there no reference to any of this in any of these texts?
None. Because the reason is, within this picturesque genre, there were what I call the two polarizations. There was the one of Stow, or of Stow, really. Say in England it was Stow, in France it was Monceau. And they were heavy in fabrique, that is the architectural follies, symbolic ideas. The other side of that spectrum is Brown in England, that has nothing in the landscape, and Morel in France, that has nothing in the landscape. And he specifically condemns the use of fabrique because what he's after is that the landscape should speak for itself. And that's an idea that comes out of Thomas Whately, association versus what he calls it, emblematic and associative. And that he wants that the landscape itself should, conjure the emotion or the thought that you want to convey. So there were these polarities, and the one that includes all those historic references is in that polarity of putting something, a pavilion in a landscape, and then boom, you see a Greek temple. Oh, you think whatever, virtue or. And it's probably over the fabrique that Morel and Girardin had a falling out, because Girardin ended up putting in, his temple of modern philosophy, which is this peripteral temple that's not yet complete. It's the idea that philosophy is still in the states of creation.
But what about ideas of, let's say, political content? I'm thinking about Humphrey Repton, the Red Book, and the way in which the ha-ha was a deliberate device to hide certain barriers, or you'd plant a copse of trees in order to hide an unsightly hamlet of peasants or something. Yeah. Is there nothing of that in this discourse either?
Not, well, those are contemporary reads. I mean, that's not in Repton himself. I mean, that we read it that it has been read. Repton has been read that way. So the texts themselves have none of the texts have any of those reads. This is more contemporary theory that's read those texts that way. Morel has none of it. It's very similar. It's very neutral that way. Although, as with most, in Morel perhaps more, the idea of a stratified society was an accepted norm at the time. So you did have, the grand seigneur and his chateau, and then you had the other person, at the lower end. And Morel, and I didn't at all mention this, has a genre system. He identifies 4 different genres, and he equates each genre with an individual, a socially placed individual, saying that that particular garden must represent who this person is. Now that's an idea right from the architecture theory as well, especially Blondel's theory, that the building has to say, okay, this is the building of of a peasant, this is the building of a grand seigneur, this is the building of the prince, of a king. And Morel does have that, but that was a very accepted norm. What is interesting in his second edition, so it's post-revolution, he sanitizes or republicanizes the language. So chateau is taken out, manoir is put in. There's no longer the grand seigneur, but it's maybe the bourgeois, something like that. So he is conscious, and no one, including myself, really hasn't developed that aspect. But he's also looking for clients. His book, the second edition, is much easier to read. He takes out the word metaphysics entirely, which he was condemned for in criticism. He takes out all the wonderful stuff about action and reaction. Takes that out. So it's a much more sanitized version.
I was just going to follow up on Anita's comment. Would you mind going back to the Vatelet front page?
Yes.
No, sorry, the Waitley, where were we? What I was going to know, I'll be quick about it. I was very struck by Anita's comment about the presence or lack thereof of paysage in these treatises you've spoken about, because it seems to me it's latent throughout, in as much as if you took a different read through, if you strung together your text, say put Roger de Pile, Diderot, Buffon, these are texts entirely about paysage or tableau. That's the frame of reference. And it would seem to me, the discourse is inconceivable without de Pile's notion of the tout ensemble. So when you look at Diderot's kind of salon criticism of Vergnaud, or, so it seems like almost having to assert a term in preference to what would have been understood, which is paysage. But what struck me, and it's fine, I'm landing in the one issue it's not present on, but what struck me about your text today is that at least 50% of the covers you showed had Milton on the...
Oh, yes.
and I'll be quick about this, because it strikes me, you had this diagram where, before and after 18th century and going from perpendicular or rectilinear to curved lines. And, if you look at Hogarth's analysis, he has Line of Beauty, but also with Milton, and it's to the serpentine, tortuous line. Yeah. And it strikes me what a insistent presence Milton is.
He's completely, even, all the theorists were not, well, Morel's second edition, I think, quotes Milton. He was absolutely critical. But doesn't Milton, it's been a while since I reread him, but because he talks about the importance that, it's the fallen world is outside the wall. But yet they are, because, there is, I'm not an expert on the text, but there are parts that were used by these people, and we all read text for our own purposes. And
it just strikes me that the emphasis, I want insist on it, but the emphasis you put at the beginning about rectilinearity and perfilinearity, that that was Hogarth's model, was the pericope from Milton, which then becomes the model for Tristram Shandy and his curvy lines. So I'd never seen these texts put together in this way where I said, my goodness, Milton he's the dude.
Yeah, actually, it's Morel, let's see, because his, okay. I don't have his, is that? Milton? Yeah, he changes, his second edition, he uses Delille. he takes Milton out. It's a great observation, actually. I'd never... Yes?
Thank you for this beautiful and beautifully illustrated talk. And this kind of rupture that the 18th century becomes when this upheaval of the regime of the axes sets in gardening. It strikes me that time must have changed. The experience of time must have changed in these spaces, either the kind of experiential or phenomenological time of the people in the landscapes as they were built, or maybe time conceived in a more naturalistic, geological level that might have influenced the way that design was thought about. Is there any reference in the primary sources to time as an explicit design factor? And anticipating that the answer is no, do you detect that time was an implicit design factor?
Time in probably the more, let me dare to say the metaphysical sense, that's not in these texts. Although geologic time, by the end of the 18th century, there's much more understanding that the world is much older than we ever thought. Buffon, in fact, published that he thought the world was 75,000 years old. In his unpublished notes, he said it was several million years old. Of course, he was resoundingly condemned because the world was simply not older than 4,700 years. So those notions, not. Time in terms of movement, yes. There is very much a lot of discussion of movement through landscapes, because each step you have a different landscape experience and you have another feeling is evoked by that experience. And then, of course, in terms of, on occasion, the very rare instances where they'll specifically address, okay, you know, this landscape's going to take 50 years to mature, so you have to, maybe you should plant more trees now and then take them out, you know, so that's a very straightforward. But, you know, in reading these texts, if you can, certainly now with Google search engine, you look for the word time, and you can then go right to town if you're looking at something. But, you know, I wanted to, you prefaced something that, at the beginning of your remarks, you were saying something that made me think of something to answer you, but I've completely forgotten what it was, but it'll come back anyway.
Did Morel specifically conjure up specific association ideas in his writings? What he was, you know, he was assuming associations, but did he ever actually say or project
No.
what any of those might be?
No. In fact, he says what you shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be putting in, you know, Chinese tents in your landscape. And these are all, I mean, what's very curious is that his almost exact contemporary was Louis Carolgis de Carmontel. They had diametrically opposed views of how this garden should be. They both worked for clients who were of equal stature. So, you know, when you have the political read of, oh, well, you know, this garden meant it was a political association. Well, here you have two guys, both princes of the blood, who have practitioner, they're landscape architects, have completely different notions about what this style is about. So I've always found it problematic to say that, you know, this is has a political thing. And of course, we know, you know, Marie Antoinette had her English, her hameau, you know. Oh, I know what I was going to say when you're talking about the beginning about time, is that, you know, and I collapsed so much here with those, you know, very schematized drawings. But I think the essential idea, and what I've always been interested in, is that all of a sudden in the 18th century, there's this new way of conceiving landscapes, and there's absolutely no regret, none whatsoever. And I just find that fascinating, that, you know, certainly not in what's been written about the picturesque. Oh, you know, everyone talks about, and the emphasis has been on literary sources and poetic sources, not, you know, it might read the importance of the science behind this. And the fact that, you know, in art history, if there are major battles over changes in style in art history, but everyone accepted this. It changes in the 19th century, actually. People start writing, say, hey, you know, we've gone overboard. We need to bring back some regularity. So.
I don't want to bring back regularity, but on the topic of no regrets, thank you so much, Joseph.